2 Timothy 3rd chapter, 14th verse through the 4th chapter, 5th verse. The point of this passage is that as children of God, we need to maintain self-control and live wisely so that we are in good standings with God. This passage has two characters, Paul and Timothy. Paul is an apostle who served under Jesus. And he's a missionary who's traveling around preaching the gospel of Christ. Timothy is his protege. Paul refers to Timothy as his son in the faith. During this time, Paul is in Rome, and Timothy is in Ephesus. Paul writes to Timothy a letter, which is called an epistle. And he's telling Timothy things that he's going to endure. But the purpose of the letter is to encourage him. He wants to encourage him, but he wants to be stern in his encouragement because he knows what Timothy is up against. So in this letter, Paul is telling Timothy that he is going to have to stand, not waver. He reminds Timothy that he is knowledgeable to God's word. He's known God's word. He's trust those who has provided him with God's word since he was a child. Therefore, Paul is encouraging Timothy to speak God's word and only God's word, because it's only God's word that's going to stand against the false doctrine. Paul reminds Timothy that in all his knowing, that even beyond his childhood, that Paul picked up and he began to teach him about the gospel of Christ. See, what Timothy knew from childhood was, the sacred writings, the law. What Paul was teaching him was the gospel of Christ. Paul reminds him that you're a believer. You trust in God's word. You do. So therefore, don't follow the false doctrines, the myths that you're going to come across in Ephesus, because it's present and is there. And the people are following it. Paul reminds him or encourages him through the letter that God's word is imparted in him. And it has become his second nature. Along with that, Paul tells Timothy, prayer. You got to pray. All of this is going to be pointless if you don't have a prayer life. Prayer life and God's words is your second nature. God's words are, he knows these words. He knows them. He knows the scriptures. Paul is telling him, this is your second nature. And it has to remain your second nature because you're going to be preaching this in season and out of season, which means at a drop of a dime, anywhere you are, you're going to have to minister against the false doctrine. There's going to be people that's going to challenge you. Don't waver. You know this. You know his word. You know the scriptures. Stay prayed up. This is basically what Paul is telling Timothy. The charge that in 2 Timothy 4, 4th chapter, 1st through the 2nd verse, Paul gives Timothy a charge. And the charge is that he's stressing to Timothy the importance of his task, which actually is not a task. Paul wants Timothy to realize this is not a task. This is not something I'm telling you to do, instructing you to do. This is a call on your life. This is a call from God. This is what God is calling you to do, to minister to these people in Ephesus, to teach them, teach against the false doctrine, to not waver, stand firm in what you know is truth, and speak it and teach it. Of course, during this time, Paul and Timothy were concerned with persecution, which came great with being a follower of Christ. But God said, stand firm in it. You still have to stand firm in it because it's the truth. Paul is stressing this to Timothy because he's accountable to God. He wants Timothy to recognize and acknowledge that he is accountable to God, not accountable to Paul. Paul is just pretty much telling him what it is that he needs to do, but that this charge comes from God and God only, and that God and that he's accountable to God for what he says, for what he ministers, what he teaches. And the reason he's accountable is because he knows this word. He knows God's word. So God expects him to teach and preach what he know is Bible-based truth and nothing but. He also tells him that you need to have a prayer life. You have to have a prayer life. You cannot minister, teach, or preach and not have a prayer life. Not have a prayer life. Prayer life and God's word must be second nature in order for you to stand against the false doctrines.